In the spring of 1203, a teenage boy disappeared from a castle in Normandy, and no one ever saw him again. His name was Arthur of Brittany, and by many reasonable interpretations of law and custom, he was the rightful king of England. His fate remains one of the medieval world's most chilling unsolved questions, with evidence pointing in a deeply uncomfortable direction. Incredibly, this disappearance would start a chain reaction that would help bring down a massive medieval empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. To understand why Arthur mattered, we have to understand the succession crisis that erupted when Richard the Lionheart died in April 1199. Richard left no legitimate children, which proved to be a significant issue for the English and French holdings later dubbed the Angevin Empire by historians. Under the principle of primogeniture, the crown should arguably have passed to Arthur, the son of Richard's deceased older brother, Geoffrey. Arthur was born in 1187, after Geoffrey's death, making him the posthumous heir of the elder Plantagenet line. But medieval succession wasn't always a straightforward matter of bloodline, and raw power was often the deciding force despite what the succession laws said. Richard's youngest brother John moved quickly, seizing the treasury at Chinon and racing to be crowned. He had powerful allies, proximity to England's political machinery, and crucially, he was an adult, while Arthur was only 12. In medieval politics, a child claimant without a powerful protector was little more than a target. This situation was further complicated by Eleanor of Aquitaine, the now elderly but still extremely formidable Queen Mother. Eleanor threw her considerable influence behind John, understanding that a child king controlled by French regents would be disastrous. She worked tirelessly to secure John's position, effectively abandoning her grandson to political irrelevance. Her choice would have consequences that echoed through the rest of the century and beyond. The legal argument for Arthur's claim was strong but not unchallenged. English custom sometimes favored the nearest surviving brother of a dead king over a nephew, particularly when that nephew was a minor. Continental tradition, on the other hand, leaned firmly toward the throne passing to Arthur. Arthur had a very legitimate case, but the political winds favored John, especially in England itself. The English baronage preferred a grown man who could lead armies over a boy who'd need a regent, and who came with Breton advisors. They may have also seen John as a known factor, someone who could be controlled and manipulated by them, rather than by continental nobles. In Brittany, and among French-aligned nobles, however, Arthur was recognized as the rightful Plantagenet heir. His claim carried weight under the legal customs of the Angevin continental territories. Philip II, the powerful king of France, saw an enormous opportunity in this fractured succession. By backing Arthur's claim, he could shatter the Angevin Empire from within, breaking the continental power of the English throne that rivaled his own. Philip accepted Arthur's homage for Brittany, Anjou, and Aquitaine, recognizing him as the legitimate ruler of vast continental territories. For Arthur, still barely a teenager, this alliance with the French crown was both his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. He became a pawn in a game far larger than himself, manipulated by forces that cared nothing for his welfare. Every adult in his orbit had their own agenda, and none of those agendas prioritized keeping him alive the moment he ceased to be politically useful. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1202, when Arthur, now 15, was persuaded to besiege the castle of Mirbeau. His own grandmother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, was staying at Mirbeau, making the siege a direct family confrontation, a disastrous miscalculation in hindsight. John's forces, led by William de Roche, executed a lightning march and caught Arthur's army off guard at dawn on August 1st. The victory was total, and Arthur was captured along with hundreds of supporters, including prominent Breton nobles. John's troops covered roughly 80 miles in 48 hours to reach Marbeau, a feat of forced marching that showed real military skill by an otherwise incompetent king. But if you're familiar with King John's reign, you'll know that he would somehow manage to fumble this generational victory. It was a military triumph, but what followed would prove to be one of the medieval world's greatest political catastrophes. John immediately alienated William de Roche by refusing to consult him on the treatment of the prisoners. William defected to the French side, taking much of the Angevin military apparatus along with him. It was a pattern that defined John's reign, turning victories into disasters through sheer political incompetence. John initially held Arthur at Falaise, one of the great ducal castles of Normandy. Chroniclers writing within a generation say John visited Arthur in captivity and tried to persuade him to abandon his claim. Arthur reportedly refused, insisting on his rights to the Angevin inheritance and demanding the release of his companions. Whether this account is precisely accurate is unknowable, but the political reality behind it rings true. Arthur being alive was a permanent rallying point for John's enemies, and while Arthur supporting John might have been useful, his defiant stand was intolerable. By early 1203, Arthur was transferred to the castle of Rouen, the capital of the Duchy of Normandy, and then, just like that, he disappeared off the face of the earth. There was no public trial, no announcement of his death, and no burial record that has ever been found. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record after entering Rouen's keep, and the silence itself is damning. A king doesn't simply misplace a nephew who happens to be his chief political rival, nor do kings quietly lose track of their most important political prisoners. Arthur's disappearance was almost certainly deliberate, and the absence of any official explanation implies those responsible knew the truth couldn't be spoken. Several near-contemporary chroniclers offered accounts of Arthur's death, and while they differ in detail, they converge on one point. The Annals of Margam, written at a Welsh abbey with connections to the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, provide the most explicit account. According to this source, John himself slew Arthur after dinner on the Thursday before Easter in April 1203, while drunk. The body was reportedly weighted with a stone and thrown into the Seine to cover up the enormity of the crime. Under this telling, the river became Arthur's unmarked grave, swallowing all physical evidence of the shameful act. This chronicle was composed within a few decades of the event and claims its information came from reliable informants. Ralph of Coggeshall, a famous English chronicler of the same period, offered a somewhat different version. He recorded that John initially sent servants to Falaise with orders to blind Arthur and render him a eunuch, rendering him politically useless. The only problem is that this order would have been considered more reprehensible than an execution in the medieval mind. The Castellan, Hubert de Burgh, supposedly refused to carry out the order precisely because this would have been viewed as a virtually unforgivable sin. According to Ralph, Hubert later claimed Arthur had died, only to reveal him to be alive when the outcry from Breton nobles threatened wider rebellion. Ralph's account trails off regarding Arthur's ultimate fate, but the implication is clear enough that the young claimant didn't survive much longer after this reprieve. Another chronicler, a Flemish source with court connections, added yet another layer to the story. This account described how Arthur was moved between locations and that his fate was a matter of rumor even among John's own courtiers. The uncertainty itself became a political weapon, with John apparently content to let ambiguity reign. This suggests that whatever happened to Arthur was perhaps so horrific that even those most loyal to King John had to be kept in the dark. William the Breton, a French chronicler close to King Philip II, placed blame squarely on John for the slaying. The Breton tradition was even more emphatic, casting Arthur as a martyred prince killed by a fearful usurper. However, this account clearly had a political motivation, given that it was authored by a person with a strong interest in seeing Arthur alive. Notably, no credible medieval source ever suggested Arthur survived or died of natural causes. Whatever happened at Rouen, the consequences were enormous, and Arthur's disappearance triggered exactly the kind of political crisis John had presumably hoped to avoid. The Breton nobility was outraged since they'd lost their duke, and they held John personally responsible for whatever happened. King Philip, who was King John's liege lord in relation to his French holdings, demanded that John appear in Paris to answer for his crimes against Arthur. When John predictably refused to appear, Philip declared all of John's French fiefs forfeit, an act that wasn't just legal theater. It provided the legal basis for a French campaign that would, by 1204, strip John of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. The Angevin continental empire, built over generations and which was wealthier than all of England, collapsed in barely 2 years. The loss of Normandy was catastrophic for John's reputation and his reign. English barons holding lands on both sides of the Channel were forced to choose between their English and Norman holdings. Importantly, most of the most powerful members of the English nobility had substantial continental holdings. Many barons blamed John directly, and the whispered accusations surrounding Arthur's fate followed him for the rest of his life. Even John's loyalist barons were reportedly horrified, not by the act itself, but by the clumsiness and political stupidity of it. A king who couldn't even manage the optics of eliminating a rival was a king who couldn't be trusted. The political toxicity of Arthur's fate fed directly into the broader baronial discontent building against John. This discontent would eventually produce the crisis of 1215, and ultimately, the Magna Carta. The barons who forced John to seal that charter at Runnymede were motivated by many grievances, but trust was central to all of them. A king capable of slaying his own nephew in the most haphazard way possible was a king whose promises meant nothing without enforceable guarantees. Of course, John didn't lose his continental possessions solely because of Arthur's death, but the mysterious disappearance provided his enemies with a moral justification that proved devastatingly effective across the political landscape. Notably, Hubert de Burgh, who features in several accounts as the man who initially refused to harm Arthur, had a successful later career. He served as Justiciar of England under Henry III, rising to become one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Whether this reflects genuine moral courage or complicated complicity that was conveniently rewritten is impossible to determine. After all, medieval political survival often required a flexible relationship with the truth. Arthur of Brittany was 16 years old at most when he died. He never ruled, never commanded an army in any meaningful sense, and never proved or disproved his fitness for the crown. Everything about his short life was shaped by the ambitions of others. His mother Constance of Brittany used his claim to maintain Breton independence from the Plantagenet crown. Philip Augustus used it to destabilize the Angevin Empire, and John eliminated it in the most final way available. What makes Arthur's case resonate both now and in the past is the combination of his youth, his strong claim, and the brazenness of his disappearance. While eliminating political rivals was by no means unheard of, this simply wasn't how things were done. Rival claimants had quote-unquote hunting accidents, or suddenly took ill after eating a lavish meal. If the most sensationalistic version of the story is true, John did the deed with his own hands, a true aberration even in the cruel world of medieval Europe. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying my content. Also, remember to check out the Patreon or YouTube membership if you enjoy my content and want to support my channel further. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies had swept across Central Asia, obliterated kingdoms, sacked Baghdad, and pushed deep into Europe. They'd conquered Song China, subjugated Korea, and destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire with terrifying speed and precision. From the steppes of Mongolia to the very gates of Vienna, no military force on earth had successfully resisted them in a sustained campaign. So when Kublai Khan turned his attention toward the Japanese archipelago in the 1270s, his advisors assumed it'd be another easy conquest. Japan was a collection of islands ruled by feudal warriors who'd never faced a continental superpower or encountered Mongol siege tactics. At least that's what the Mongols believed, and they had every reason to be confident given their record of military triumph. What actually happened across two invasion attempts in 1274 and 1281 turned out to be a dramatic reversal of expectations. It became one of the most consequential military episodes of the medieval world, and it changed the trajectory of Japanese history forever. The story doesn't begin with ships and swords, though. It begins with letters. Starting in 1268, Kublai Khan dispatched diplomatic missions to Japan, demanding submission to Mongol authority. The letters were blunt: comply and establish tributary relations, or face invasion, standard procedure for the Mongols. These messages were received by the Kamakura shogunate, the military government that held real political power in Japan at the time. While the emperor in Kyoto remained the nominal head of state, the Kamakura government made the decisions that actually mattered. The idea that the head of state of Japan called himself an emperor had long been an affront to the Chinese. Under their belief, all countries were subject to the Chinese emperor, and the emperor himself had been granted that position by heaven itself. For the Japanese, to accept tributary status to China was completely unacceptable, as it undermined the entire imperial household and the Japanese state itself. The court in Kyoto was alarmed, and temples and shrines were ordered to pray for the nation's protection. That response might seem quaint, but it reflected the genuine terror the Mongol name inspired across all of Asia. The regent Hojo Tokimune, barely 18 years old when the first letter arrived, refused to respond to Kublai's demands. Subsequent Mongol envoys were turned away, and eventually, in a dramatic escalation, later envoys were executed on the spot. Tokimune's defiance wasn't reckless bravado, but a calculated political statement about Japanese sovereignty. The shogun understood that submission would mean the end of Japanese sovereignty and the dismantling of the samurai class's power. If the imperial system was undermined, the samurai, who had positioned themselves as quote-unquote protectors of the emperor, would be disenfranchised. Kublai Khan launched his first invasion force in the autumn of 1274, assembling a fleet on the Korean peninsula. Korea, then known as Goryeo, had been forced into vassal status and was compelled to provide ships, sailors, and soldiers for the campaign. The invasion force was substantial, likely numbering around 900 vessels, carrying roughly 15,000 Mongol and Chinese soldiers. An additional 8,000 Korean troops joined the expedition, along with siege engineers and some cavalry. Transporting horses across the sea presented serious logistical challenges, but the Mongols were determined to bring their arsenal. The Mongol fleet first struck Tsushima, a small island in the strait between Korea and Japan, where the local garrison was overwhelmed. The island's defender, So Sukakuni, led perhaps 80 mounted warriors against thousands of Mongol troops in a hopeless last stand. The defenders were massacred, and the civilian population suffered terribly under Mongol rule, apparently foreshadowing the doom that awaited Japan as a whole. The invaders then moved on to Iki Island, where the pattern repeated with similar brutality. These early engagements gave the Mongols confidence and sent shockwaves through the Japanese mainland as reports spread. The main landing took place at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu, where the real battle would unfold. Here, the Japanese defenders got their first real look at Mongol warfare, and it was unlike anything they'd encountered. The Mongols used coordinated unit tactics, massed infantry formations, poisoned arrows, and explosive gunpowder bombs. The noise and smoke were disorienting, and Japanese warriors described the thunderous explosions as something from another world. I feel that it's necessary to describe briefly how different the Japanese approach to war and combat was to the Mongolian approach. Japanese warfare at this time was heavily influenced by traditions of individual combat and personal dueling between worthy opponents. Warriors would ride forward, announce their lineage and accomplishments, and seek out rivals for one-on-one encounters. This format of combat was highly ritualized and emphasized elements like honorable conduct on the battlefield and personal displays of valor. While the Mongols may have had somewhat similar values in intertribal conflicts on the Eurasian steppe, they had long since adapted a bureaucratic approach to combat. The Mongols had absolutely no interest in such rituals and fought as disciplined units with coordinated battlefield tactics. They used signal drums and flags to direct movements, surrounding and overwhelming isolated samurai with ruthless efficiency. The fighting at Hakata Bay was intense, and the Japanese were pushed back from the shoreline under heavy pressure. However, the samurai regrouped and mounted fierce resistance, and the terrain itself worked against the Mongol cavalry. The narrow beaches and coastal landscape prevented Mongol horsemen from maneuvering effectively against the defenders. As night fell, the Mongol commanders made a fateful decision, ordering their troops back to the ships rather than pressing inland. That night, a powerful storm struck Hakata Bay, causing significant damage to the anchored Mongol fleet. Several ships were lost, and the invasion force, battered and demoralized, withdrew back to Korea in disarray. And just like that, the first Mongol invasion had failed, and the legend of the storm that helped repel them grew. The 7 years between the invasions were anything but quiet for either side of the conflict. The Kamakura government, now fully aware of the existential threat, undertook an enormous defensive building program. The centerpiece was a massive stone wall constructed along the coastline of Hakata Bay, stretching roughly 20 kilometers. The wall stood about 2 meters high, designed specifically to prevent Mongol cavalry from establishing a beachhead on the shore. It was a remarkable feat of medieval engineering, constructed through the forced labor of samurai vassals from across Kyushu. The remnants of this wall can still be seen in Fukuoka today, a tangible reminder of how seriously Japan took the threat. Beyond physical fortifications, the government reorganized its military command structure and appointed new defense commissioners in Kyushu. Coastal watch stations were established, naval capabilities were improved, and samurai forces were kept on high alert for years. The entire western coast of Japan was placed on a permanent war footing, straining the economic resources of the warrior class. Kublai Khan, meanwhile, continued sending envoys demanding Japan's submission, and the response grew increasingly hostile. In 1275 and again in 1279, Mongol ambassadors were beheaded, a profound insult that left no ambiguity about Japan's position. Kublai was reportedly furious, and the subjugation of Japan became a matter of deep personal prestige for the emperor. The final conquest of the Southern Song dynasty in 1279 freed up enormous military resources for a second attempt at Japan. The Mongols were now fully in control in China, and the stage was set for a far larger invasion than anything the Japanese had yet faced. The 1281 invasion was one of the largest naval operations attempted anywhere in the world before the modern era. Kublai Khan assembled two massive fleets for a coordinated two-pronged assault on the Japanese archipelago. The Eastern Route Army departed from Korea with roughly 900 ships, carrying around 40,000 trained combat troops. The Southern Route Army sailed from southern China with approximately 3,500 vessels and 100,000 soldiers. Many of those soldiers were recently conquered Song Chinese troops whose loyalty to the Mongol cause was questionable at best. The combined force of roughly 140,000 men dwarfed the 1274 expedition in every conceivable way. It represented an almost unprecedented commitment of military resources and logistical planning for a single campaign. And notably, most historians believe these aren't your typical exaggerated pre-modern troop numbers, but rather fairly accurate assessments of Mongol might. The plan called for both fleets to rendezvous near Kyushu and launch a coordinated assault on the Japanese defenses. The Eastern Route Army arrived first in June of 1281 and attempted to land at several points around Hakata Bay. This time, however, they encountered the stone defensive wall that the Japanese had spent 7 years building along the coast. Japanese defenders positioned behind the fortifications rained arrows and launched counterattacks against Mongol forces on the beaches. Small, fast Japanese boats conducted daring nighttime raids against the anchored fleet, boarding ships and setting fires. These guerrilla naval tactics are documented in the famous Mokoshirai Ekotoba scroll, commissioned by the samurai Takazaki Suenaga. The raids proved devastatingly effective against the larger, less maneuverable Mongol vessels crowding the harbor waters. Notably, Takazaki Suenaga is a perfect example of that Japanese approach to warfare I briefly mentioned earlier. His desire to prove his valor in conducting raids on Mongol ships led to the commission of the scrolls that showed the nature of his deeds. If he had been operating under a more bureaucratic system, like the Mongols were, he would have had little incentive to produce these records which historians now rely upon. But I digress. The samurai had adapted considerably since the first invasion, studying Mongol tactics and developing effective countermeasures. Individual combat traditions gave way to coordinated defensive operations, at least temporarily, and the coastal fortifications proved their immense worth. For weeks, the Mongols couldn't establish a secure position on land, and the Eastern Route Army suffered heavy casualties. Most of the invasion force was trapped aboard its ships, unable to break through the Japanese defensive lines on shore. When the Southern Route Army finally arrived in August, the combined fleet anchored in Hakata Bay in massive numbers. It created a vast floating city of ships and soldiers, but the prolonged time at sea had taken a serious toll. Disease spread through the cramped ships, fresh water and provisions ran low, and morale deteriorated rapidly. While this was a Mongol invasion, the vast majority of the soldiers and sailors were Chinese and Korean and had little reason to throw their lives away for a foreign conqueror dynasty. It's theorized that many of these Mongol subjects defected to the Japanese side, bringing valuable intelligence along with them in return for their lives being spared. Then, in mid-August, the decisive blow fell when a massive typhoon slammed into the Mongol fleet with devastating force. The timing couldn't have been worse for the invaders, with ships packed tightly together, unable to maneuver or seek shelter. Thousands of ships were sunk or smashed against the rocks, and tens of thousands of soldiers drowned in the waters. Those who made it to shore were hunted down or captured by Japanese forces waiting on the beaches. Estimates suggest the Mongols lost between 60 and 90% of their entire invasion force in the disaster. It would go down as one of the most devastating military catastrophes in recorded history. The Japanese interpreted the typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets as divine intervention by the gods of their homeland. They called these storms kamikaze, meaning divine wind, a term that would echo through Japanese culture for centuries afterward. The belief took hold that Japan was a shinkoku, a sacred land protected by the gods, unconquerable by any foreign power. This concept became deeply embedded in Japan's national identity, reinforced by Shinto priests and Buddhist monks across the country. Religious leaders claimed their prayers had summoned the storms, strengthening the bond between faith and national defense. The consequences of the failed invasions rippled through both Japan and the Mongol Empire in profound ways. For Kublai, the defeats were both humiliating and financially ruinous, draining the Yuan treasury of enormous resources. The invasions had required conscripting tens of thousands of shipbuilders and requisitioning vast quantities of timber and iron. Military resources had been diverted from other frontiers, weakening Mongol positions across the empire's vast holdings. Kublai reportedly considered a third invasion, but was dissuaded by advisors and by the practical difficulties of replacing such losses. Rebellions elsewhere in his empire demanded attention, and the political will for another campaign had evaporated. He died in 1294, a diminished figure in many respects, without ever conquering the island nation that had defied him twice. For Japan, the aftermath was paradoxically both triumphant and destabilizing for the ruling government. The samurai who'd fought to defend Kyushu expected rewards, as was customary after military campaigns. But unlike a typical campaign of conquest, there was no conquered territory to distribute and no plunder to divide among the warriors. The war had been entirely defensive, and the Kamakura government was already under severe financial strain from a decade of preparations. The government couldn't adequately compensate the warriors who'd risked everything, creating deep resentment among the samurai class. This bitterness, particularly fierce in Kyushu, contributed directly to the political instability that toppled the regime in 1333. The very warriors who'd saved Japan from foreign conquest helped bring down the government that had organized the defense. The Mongol invasions of Japan remain one of history's great what-if scenarios and a pivotal moment in East Asian history. Had the typhoons not struck, Japan might have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, fundamentally altering the region's development. Japanese culture, language, religion, and political structures would have developed along radically different lines under Mongol rule. Given the immense outlay of manpower and other resources, most historians agree that Kublai wouldn't have allowed Japan to maintain any meaningful autonomy. The invasions also demonstrated both the terrifying reach of Mongol power and its very real limitations on the open sea. It perhaps should come as no surprise that a group from Central Asia, with quite literally no naval tradition whatsoever, was not best equipped to handle such an invasion. The immense logistical challenges of seaborne invasion, with unpredictable weather and supply chain vulnerabilities, proved insurmountable. Even the greatest military machine of the medieval era couldn't overcome the fundamental difficulties of projecting power across the ocean. Modern archaeology has added fascinating new dimensions to this story through underwater discoveries off the coast of Nagasaki Prefecture. Researchers found Mongol shipwrecks near Takashima, confirming historical accounts and revealing the hasty construction of the invasion fleet. Many vessels were flat-bottomed riverboats poorly suited for open ocean conditions, built under enormous political pressure. Ceramic artifacts, stone anchor stocks, and weaponry from the seabed painted a vivid picture of the doomed expedition's composition. These findings suggest the fleet was vulnerable even before the typhoon struck, designed for the wrong kind of water entirely. The invasions also reshaped Japanese military culture in lasting and significant ways over the generations that followed. The samurai adapted their tactics, fortification strategies, and understanding of large-scale warfare based on their experience. Facing a continental army forced Japan's warrior class to evolve, and the defensive infrastructure influenced coastal thinking for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the invasion cemented a powerful narrative of Japanese exceptionalism in the national consciousness. The idea that Japan occupied a unique and divinely protected place in the world took deep root in the culture. It was a belief that would profoundly shape the nation's self-understanding well into the modern era. Unfortunately, it was this belief that also led the Japanese leadership in the 20th century to believe that defeat was impossible, a fact that would have disastrous consequences for humanity. For the better part of a century, the Magyar horsemen had been the nightmare of Christian Europe. Riding out of the Hungarian steppe in waves that seemed endless, they'd burned monasteries, sacked cities, and humiliated kings from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Their raids weren't random acts of violence, but precision operations carried out by some of the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. These were warriors who could fire arrows at full gallop and vanish before any organized resistance could form. By the middle of the 10th century, people across the German lands, Italy, and France viewed these raids as a permanent condition. It was a seasonal catastrophe, as unavoidable as drought or flood, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. The Magyars had first swept into the Carpathian Basin around 895, a Finno-Ugric people driven west by the Pechenegs. They displaced the peoples already living there and established a base of operations with access to virtually every corner of Europe. From this homeland, war bands fanned out along well-scouted routes, exploiting the political fragmentation of the post-Carolingian world. The old Frankish Empire had shattered into squabbling successor states, with no capacity for coordinated defense. No single ruler possessed the military strength or political authority to mount a coordinated response. Local lords built castles and prayed, and that was about the extent of the strategic response for decades. What made the Magyar threat so difficult to counter was their tactical doctrine of fighting exclusively as mounted archers. They used the composite bow with devastating skill, and their preferred method was the feigned retreat. This maneuver lured overconfident pursuers into disorganized chases before the Magyars wheeled around and destroyed them with arrows. Western heavy cavalry, trained for the direct shock charge, found itself consistently outmaneuvered by these tactics. The Magyars didn't want to stand and fight, nor did they want to occupy land for any period of time. Instead, they wanted to raid, extract tribute from wealthy settled rulers, and leave, returning to the safety of the far western reaches of the Eurasian steppe. That was, at least, until one man decided to put an end to the Hungarian raids once and for all. By 955, the political landscape had shifted in important ways, and one of the successors to Charlemagne was showing serious promise. Otto I, king of the East Franks, and the most powerful ruler in Central Europe, had spent years consolidating his authority. He'd done so through a combination of military force, strategic marriages, and alliance building with the church. He wasn't the first German king to fight the Magyars, and his father, Henry the Fowler, had won a notable victory at the Battle of Riyadh in 933. Henry's program of fortress construction and cavalry reform had begun to change the defensive equation. But Otto now faced a crisis that demanded something far more decisive than border defense. In the summer of 955, a massive Magyar army crossed into Bavaria, possibly numbering between 8,000 and 25,000 warriors. They laid siege to Augsburg, a prosperous city on the Lech River and a critical hub of Bavarian territory. The city's bishop, Ulrich of Augsburg, organized a desperate defense, rallying the garrison. He personally appeared on the walls in full episcopal vestments to stiffen the resolve of the defenders. The Magyars probed the city's defenses and launched assaults, but Augsburg held, buying Otto the time he needed to assemble his forces. Otto moved quickly, gathering contingents from across the German duchies, including troops from Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Saxony, and Bohemia. Widukind of Corvey, a Saxon monk whose account is among the most valuable primary sources, describes an army of roughly 8 legions. Liutprand of Cremona, another contemporary chronicler, largely corroborates this picture of a substantial force. Historians have generally interpreted the size of Otto's assembled army as somewhere around 10,000 men, which was very large for the era. This reflected the remarkable degree to which Otto had succeeded in commanding loyalty across the fractious German political landscape. Notably, his army also included a Bohemian contingent under Duke Boleslav I, a former bitter enemy brought into Otto's orbit through careful diplomacy. On August 10, 955, the two armies met on the Lechfeld, the broad floodplain south of Augsburg. The Lech River spreads across flat, open ground there, terrain that should have favored the Magyars and their mobile tactics. But the battle didn't begin the way anyone expected it to. The Magyars sent a strong detachment across the river to strike at Otto's supply train and rear guard in a bold flanking maneuver. This flanking force hit the Bohemian and Swabian contingents hard, scattering them in confusion and capturing the entire baggage train. For a terrible moment, it looked as though the Magyars had already won before the main engagement had even properly started. If the German army's cohesion collapsed under the pressure of that devastating rear attack, the entire force would dissolve into a rout. This would have been particularly devastating since the Magyar light cavalry would have been able to obliterate the men on their disorganized retreat. But Otto's response was decisive, and by all accounts personally courageous under the most extraordinary pressure. He redirected his Franconian contingent under Duke Conrad the Red to deal with the flanking threat. Otto himself led the main body forward in a direct frontal assault on the Magyar center, rallying his troops as he rode ahead. Conrad's counterattack succeeded in driving the Magyar flanking force back across the river, saving the army from total disintegration. Conrad himself, however, was killed in the fighting when he loosened his armor in the brutal heat and took an arrow through the throat. His death was a significant and deeply felt loss, but his intervention at the critical moment had preserved the entire German position. The main engagement then became exactly the kind of close-quarters fight the Magyars desperately didn't want. Otto's heavy cavalry, armored knights on powerful war horses, charged directly into the Magyar formations with devastating and terrible force. The Lechfeld, despite being open ground, simply didn't give the Magyars enough room to execute their preferred feigned retreat tactic. The Germans pressed the attack relentlessly, and the brutal close-quarters combat neutralized every advantage the Magyars had in mobility. The battle became a grinding melee, and in that kind of fight, the sheer weight of Western heavy cavalry was simply overwhelming. The Magyar lines broke, and what followed was a relentless pursuit that lasted for days across the Bavarian countryside. The retreating raiders were cut down in enormous numbers, and many drowned attempting to cross swollen rivers in their desperate panic. Villagers and local garrisons, emboldened by the spreading news of victory, fell upon stragglers with a fury born of decades of suffering. The 3 senior Magyar commanders, known in the sources as Bulksu, Lel, and Sur, were captured alive and then hanged at Regensburg. The execution of these enemy leaders was a calculated and deliberate statement of finality from a king who intended to be emperor. He wasn't merely winning a single battle, he was consciously and permanently ending an era of terror that had affected all of Catholic Europe. The Battle of Lechfeld didn't end all Magyar raids overnight, but it broke the strategic pattern that had terrorized Europe for generations. The Magyars never again launched a major incursion into German territory after the catastrophic disaster on the Lechfeld. Within a few decades, the Hungarian ruling dynasty under Géza, and then his son Stephen, would embrace Christianity and settle permanently. The conversion wasn't solely a consequence of Lechfeld, but the defeat made clear that the old nomadic raiding economy was finished. The Magyars needed to find a new way to relate to their neighbors, and Christianization offered a path toward legitimacy and integration. In a somewhat ironic twist, the Magyars themselves would, just a few centuries later, go on to defend Christian Europe from the Mongols, who used similar mounted tactics. For Otto personally, the victory was transformative in ways that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield itself. His army had hailed him as Imperator on the field, a title with deliberate echoes of Rome that no German king had convincingly claimed. 7 years later, in 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, formalizing his newly won imperial authority. Lechfeld didn't single-handedly recreate the Holy Roman Empire, long fractured since Charlemagne's days, but it provided the credibility that made Otto's ambitions real. He'd proven he could do what no ruler had managed in living memory: unite the duchies, confront the Magyars, and win decisively. The broader European significance of Lechfeld truly can't be overstated, as it stabilized Central Europe at a critical and fragile juncture. Notably, the 10th century saw Western Christendom beset simultaneously by Magyar raids from the east, Vikings from the north, and attacks from the Islamic world. Lechfeld eliminated one of those three existential threats permanently, and showed that coordinated action under strong leadership could work. It powerfully reinforced the feudal model in which regional lords owed service to a king who could organize large-scale defense in return. Lechfeld entered the collective memory of medieval Europe almost immediately after the fighting had stopped. Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg, whose defense of the city had been so crucial, was canonized in 993 through the official papal process. He became the first person ever formally canonized by a pope, and his story became deeply intertwined with the battle's larger narrative. This reinforced the powerful idea that Lechfeld had been a divinely ordained victory of Christendom over the pagan invaders of the East. Otto himself actively cultivated this interpretation, presenting the victory as evidence of God's favor and his own fitness to rule. In Hungary, the memory of Lechfeld carried a very different and far more complex emotional weight among the Magyar people. The defeat marked the painful end of the nomadic warrior tradition and the beginning of a difficult transition to settled Christian life. Hungarian chronicles would later frame the battle as a tragic, but ultimately necessary turning point in their long national story. They acknowledged the scale of the military disaster while simultaneously emphasizing the cultural transformation that followed in its wake. The execution of Bolcsú, Lel, and Szür became the stuff of enduring Hungarian legend, with vivid stories of their defiance before death. Notably, from a military perspective, Lechfeld is often cited as definitive proof of heavy cavalry's superiority over light cavalry in pitched battle. But that reading oversimplifies what actually happened on the field that hot August day in 955. The Magyar flanking maneuver very nearly succeeded, and only Otto's personal leadership and Conrad's sacrifice prevented total catastrophe. The battle demonstrated the critical importance of discipline, unit cohesion, and command under pressure as much as any weapon's advantage. Those human qualities, more than any particular weapon system or formation, were what ultimately won the day. Lechfeld fully deserves its place among the most decisive battles of European history for what it permanently changed. It reshaped the political geography of Central Europe, accelerated Hungary's Christianization, and laid the Holy Roman Empire's true foundation. It was the moment when a fragmented, terrorized collection of duchies proved it could function as something greater than its individual parts. For the Magyars, it was the closing of one long and bloody chapter and the reluctant, painful opening of another. The floodplain south of Augsburg became the ground on which the political shape of medieval Europe truly began to emerge. Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what you're doing while listening. Picture a medieval market square. A wild man, hairy and unkempt, stands watching a customer bargain with a cobbler. The customer, a young man, insists on buying leather to patch his shoes and demands the cobbler use the strongest stitching possible so they will last him another year. The wild man throws back his head and lets out a sharp, jagged bark of laughter. The customer and the cobbler are so concerned by this outburst that they fetch the man in charge of the town. When the local ruler demands to know what's so funny, the wild man points a grimy finger at the customer. He explains that the young man is worried about his shoes lasting a year, yet he has no idea that he will drown before the sun sets today. This isn't the Disney-fied wizard you know and love. This is the original Merlin, or rather, Myrddin, his inspiration. He isn't a benevolent grandfather figure in blue robes. He's a deranged prophet screaming in the woods. He's one part historic Welsh bard and 2 parts manic street preacher with a sprinkle of the Lorax tossed in for good measure. This specific anecdote, found in the 12th century text Vita Merlini, captures the essence of the character before he was sanitized for chivalric romances and Victorian tales. The story begins not in a castle, but in the blood-soaked mud of the Old North, modern-day Scotland and northern England, around 573 AD. The historical prototype for Merlin was a man named Myrddin Wilt, which translates from Welsh as the Wild. He was a Welsh bard and retainer to Gwendolen, a chieftain who was slaughtered at the Battle of Arfderydd. The trauma of this event shattered Myrddin. Legends say he may have even been responsible for the death of his own nephew during the fighting. Overcome with grief and guilt, he fled into the Caledonian forest. There, he lost his mind and lived as a beast, exposed to the elements and terrified of capture. Through this trauma, he was granted prophetic inspiration born of madness, a concept that is common in Celtic folklore. While the Welsh told stories of Myrddin, the Scots in the same region told stories of a nearly identical figure named Lailechen. Most scholars agree these are the same person, filtered through different linguistic and cultural traditions. Lailechen's story is preserved in the hagiography of St. Kentigern, the patron saint of Glasgow. Lailechen is a wild man of the woods who interrupts the prayers of the saint with shrieking prophecies. He confesses that he is condemned to wander the wilderness because of his sins at the Battle of Arfderydd. 2 famous stories define Lailechen. The first is the triple death. Lailechen predicts he will die in 3 different ways simultaneously. The locals mock him, saying that it's completely impossible, but the prophecy is fulfilled grimly and accurately, at least with poetic license. He's stoned and beaten by shepherds, falls from a cliff, gets his foot caught in a root, and hangs upside down with his head submerged in the River Tweed. He is beaten, hanged, and drowned all at once. This motif served to validate his prophetic power. No matter how absurd his words seemed, they would always come true. The second story involves the Queen of Strathclyde, Langareth. She gives a ring to her lover, a knight. Her husband, King Ridderk, discovers the infidelity, steals the ring from the knight while he sleeps, and throws it into the River Clyde. He then demands the queen produce it, or face execution. Lilacon advises that a fish can be caught in the river. A salmon is then pulled out, and inside its stomach is the ring. This miracle saved the queen, and is immortalized today on the Glasgow coat of arms. The Merlin we recognize today was effectively engineered in the 1130s by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Geoffrey was a cleric writing the history of the kings of Britain. This is a massive pseudo-historical work designed to give the British people a glorious antiquity. To create a superstar wizard, Geoffrey merged the Welsh Myrddin with another figure, a fatherless boy prophet named Ambrosius from the writings of Nennius. Geoffrey's first hurdle was the name. In Welsh, Myrddin sounds dangerously close to the Anglo-Norman word for feces. To avoid having his great prophet laughed out of court, Geoffrey Latinized the name to Merlinus, changing the consonant and saving the character's dignity. Geoffrey then repurposed a story about a tower that wouldn't stand. The usurper King Vortigern tries to build a fortress, but the foundations collapse every night. His magicians claim he must sacrifice a boy without a father. Merlin is brought in and reveals the truth. The tower is collapsing because two dragons are fighting in a pool beneath the foundation. He drains the pool, revealing a red dragon, the Britons, and a white dragon, the Saxons. This prophecy gave a mythical framework to the Anglo-Saxon invasion and established Merlin as a political authority, not just a forest madman. Geoffrey also turned Merlin into a great engineer. He credits Merlin with building Stonehenge. When an army failed to move the stones with brute strength, Merlin used a system of levers and pulleys to set them up on Salisbury Plain. Other versions go heavier on the magic, with Merlin using his magic to bring giants under his command to move the huge stones. Interestingly, late in life, Geoffrey wrote Vita Merlini, a poem where he returned Merlin to his roots. He essentially retconned his own high fantasy wizard back into the traumatized wild man, complete with the laughing at shoes anecdote. It was an attempt to reconcile the courtly wizard he created with the authentic Welsh folklore he had previously ignored. As the legend crossed into France, it hit a theological wall. Arthur was a great Christian king, and his reliance on a wizard was highly questionable to audiences. Around 1200, the poet Robert de Boron solved this by rewriting Merlin's origin story to fit Christian doctrine. And trust me when I say it, this is where the story of Merlin really gets wild. He introduced the idea of the demonic patrimony. The story goes that the demons of hell were furious that Jesus Christ had redeemed so many souls. To counter this, they plotted to create their own prophet, an antichrist, so to speak. They sent an incubus to bring this monster to life, and the plan almost worked. But the mother of the half-demon child confessed to her priest immediately after the conception. The child, Merlin, was baptized the moment he was born. This baptism didn't remove his powers, but it neutralized his evil nature. From his demon father, Merlin inherited knowledge of everything past and present. From God, as a reward for his mother's piety and his baptism, he received knowledge of the future. This made him the ultimate advisor, possessing a 360-degree view of time. He wasn't a druid anymore. He was a sanctified half-demon working for the good guys, a fact that certainly didn't make it into the Disney film. Robert de Boron also connected Merlin to the Holy Grail. He established that Merlin created the Round Table as a copy of the Table of the Last Supper. He left one seat empty, the Siege Perilous, representing the betrayal of Judas, to be filled only by the Grail Knight. This shifted Merlin's role from a dynastic kingmaker to a spiritual guide preparing the kingdom for its holy quest. In the 13th century, French writers expanded the cast and introduced the element that would destroy Merlin: romance. The wild man had no time for dating, but the courtly enchanter needed a tragic flaw. In the Vulgate cycle, Merlin falls in love with Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake. He knows through his foresight that she will be his undoing, yet he is powerless to stop it, a feeling that I've felt at times in my life. He teaches her his magic during long walks in the forest. Vivienne then traps him in a tower of air or invisible walls so she can keep him to herself. The post-Vulgate cycle takes a much darker turn. Here, Merlin is an old, lustful man harassing a young woman who wants to protect her chastity. She pries his secrets out of him for self-defense. When he takes her to a cave or a tomb to show her a marvel, she uses his own spell to seal him inside. In this version, he's buried alive or trapped under a rock, crying out in vain. It is a grim, tragic end that removes the wise advisor so the kingdom can slide into the chaos of Mordred's rebellion. This shift is crucial. It marks the transition of the legend from a story of rising empire to one of inevitable tragedy. Merlin's removal is the first domino in the fall of Camelot. Sir Thomas Malory, writing Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, codified these versions into the narrative we know best. Malory emphasizes Merlin's role as a tester of character. Merlin often appears in disguise to see if Arthur and his knights will listen to wisdom regardless of the source. For instance, he will make himself appear as a teenaged boy and then give the wisest counsel possible, in hopes that Arthur can truly take the best advice. However, Malory is unsentimental about Merlin's end and follows the post-Vulgate tradition, where Merlin gives in to his lustful and demonic nature. For his sins, the great sage ends up permanently trapped under a rock, with Arthur now left to rule alone without the wise counselor. Merlin didn't start as a wizard, but as a Welsh bard, who is much better attested than the vast majority of kings of the era. He was a survivor of a brutal Scottish battle who fled into the trees to escape his memories. It took 600 years of literary evolution to drag him out of the woods, dress him in robes, and place him at the right hand of a king. He was molded by Geoffrey of Monmouth to legitimize British history, baptized by Robert de Boron to satisfy the church, and romanced by the French to entertain the court. Yet, the core of the character remains the same. Whether he is Myrddin the mad bard or the half-demonic Merlin advising Arthur, he's the outsider. He's the figure who stands apart from humanity, seeing the doom that others ignore and providing whatever advice he can, whether people take heed of it or not. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members who are interested in history. This is the absolute best way you can help my channel grow if you appreciate my work. It begins with a silence that screams. In the year 1984, archaeologists digging in the ruins of Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath, uncovered a stark testament to the chaos of the 5th century. It was the skull of a young woman, stuffed unceremoniously into a Roman oven. This grisly discovery captures the terrifying reality of sub-Roman Britain. It was a world where the orderly grid of civilization had collapsed into darkness, and where the public baths had quite literally crumbled into swamps. But out of this anarchy, one moment of defiant light emerged. A singular event that halted the tide of the Anglo-Saxon conquest for a generation and birthed a legend that would haunt the imagination of the world forever. That event was the siege of Mount Badon. We're looking for a battlefield. It is the site of the greatest victory won by the Britons, a triumph attributed by history to a desperate coalition of tribes led by a man named Arthur. Yet, despite its monumental importance, Mount Badon remains a ghost on the map. Our only contemporary guide to this violent epoch isn't a historian, but a fire and brimstone preacher named Gildas. Writing from a monastery cell in the 6th century, Gildas looked out at a Britain that was broken but currently at peace. In his polemic on the ruin and conquest of Britain, he rages against the sins of the British princes, viewing the Saxon invasions as divine punishment. But amidst his sermonizing, he drops a single golden anchor of fact: the siege of Mount Badon. Gildas tells us this battle was the, quote, final victory of our country, a slaughter of the Saxon invaders that secured a generation of peace. Unfortunately, he didn't provide a date for when it happened, only indicating very precisely that it took place 44 years and 1 month prior. This, of course, made perfect sense in Gildas's reckoning, but he was writing in a time known as the British Dark Ages, and there's a 50-year period in which he may have been writing. Historians working from Gildas have determined the battle was likely around 500 AD, but nothing can be said with any certainty. Later chroniclers muddied the waters further. The Venerable Bede, writing centuries later, stripped the victory of its Arthurian connection entirely. It wasn't until the 9th century that the Historia Britannicum, attributed to Nennius, explicitly placed Arthur at the center of the action. Nennius lists Badon as Arthur's 12th and final battle, claiming the warlord slew 960 men in a single charge. While the body count is pure mythology, likely a poetic exaggeration of a tactical unit's strength, the significance is clear. By the 800s, Badon was the crown jewel of the budding Arthurian legend. The Annals of Wales push the date even later, to 516 AD, though it isn't clear how this date was derived. Despite the confusion of dates, the archaeological record confirms Gildas's central claim. Around the year 500 AD, the westward expansion of Saxon cemeteries abruptly stops, and for 50 years the frontier froze. The hunt for Badon is primarily a linguistic puzzle. The name Badon, or Badonis, is the only coordinate we have. For centuries, the most seductive theory has linked Badon to Bath. The Old English name for the city was Badham, at the baths, and the Welsh called it Caer Fadden. It seemed to be an obvious match. However, Celtic linguists would throw cold water on the theory, proposing numerous alternative names for various sites. If we follow the Bath theory, our eyes turn to the steep hills encircling Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath. By 500 AD, the great Roman spa was a shadow of its former glory. The roof of the great bath may have already collapsed into the sacred spring. The city was likely largely abandoned, except for squatters and perhaps a local warlord's band of retainers. But strategically, Bath was, and is, a linchpin. It sits astride the Fosse Way, the arterial road connecting the southwest to the Midlands. Overlooking the city stands Little Salisbury Hill, a flat-topped eminence crowned by an Iron Age hill fort. It's a perfect defensive position. If a Saxon army had pushed west along the river valleys to seize the strategic crossing at Bath, a British army on Salisbury Hill would have been the anvil they struck. The siege described by Gildas fits the topography perfectly. The Britons trapped on the hill, the Saxons surrounding the slopes, until a breakout charge drove the invaders into the river. Medieval chroniclers like Geoffrey of Monmouth were certain Bath was the site. While we must be wary of Geoffrey's romancing, the persistence of the tradition is compelling. Travel south into the chalklands of Dorset, and you encounter a fortress that looks the part: Badbury Rings. This massive Iron Age fortification, with its multiple concentric ramparts, dominates the landscape near Wimborne Minster. Strategically, Badbury Rings is a vital choke point. It sits at the intersection of Roman roads leading to the coast and the interior. In the late 5th century, the West Saxons under Cerdic were likely pushing up from the Southampton area. To enter the heartlands of the British tribe known as the Durotriges, they had to pass Badbury. Unlike many other hill forts, Badbury Rings offers physical evidence of the struggle. Excavations have revealed that the ancient defenses were refurbished in the post-Roman period, bolstering this as the potential site. Move northeast along the spine of the ancient ridgeway, and you find Liddington Castle in Wiltshire. This hill fort, often associated with a nearby village named Badbury, commands the high ground near modern Swindon. Liddington Castle sits on a geopolitical fault line. It overlooks the Upper Thames Valley, which was one of the earliest areas of Saxon settlement. If the invaders wanted to push west toward the Severn and cut Britain in two, they had to come this way. Archaeology here is tantalizing. Excavations in 1976 uncovered pottery dating to the 5th and 6th centuries, proving the site was occupied exactly when Baden was fought. The ramparts were strengthened with timber and stone in a phase that corresponds to the Arthurian era. A victory here would have bottled up the Thames Valley Saxons for decades, matching the historical pause in expansion perfectly. We must also briefly consider the outliers. Some historians, noting Nennius's placement of Arthur's other battles in the north, argue it may have been in Scotland. However, the strategic reality of Baden fights against this. Gildas was concerned with the Saxon threat to the civilian centers of lowland Britain. A battle in Scotland, while possible for a northern warlord, would hardly have stopped the Saxon advance in Sussex and Wessex. Simply put, a British victory in the far north would do little to explain the halt of the Saxon menace in England. Regardless of the specific hill, we can reconstruct the terror of the siege. This was not a battle of shining knights. It was a gritty, desperate standoff. The British Comitatus, a professional corps of mounted warriors preserving the last scraps of Roman military doctrine, would have held the summit. Their leader was Arthur, or a man who would come to be known as such, and he wasn't a king but a war leader of a confederation of Romano-Britons and native Britons. They would have looked down on a sea of Saxon shields, men armed with ash spears and terrifying throwing axes. Gildas's mention of a siege implies the Britons were trapped. The 3 days and 3 nights mentioned in the annals suggests a stalemate broken by a decisive action. We can imagine the thirst, the smoke, and the final thunderous sortie. The British cavalry charging down the slopes, using the momentum of the hill to shatter the Saxon shield wall. It was a victory won not by Arthurian magic, but by iron and desperation. Ultimately, the exact location of Mount Baden may remain forever beneath the soil, guarded by the silence of the centuries. But its reality is etched into the timeline of Britain. For 50 years after the battle, the fires of the invasion dimmed. The British language, the Christian church, and the memory of Rome were given a stay of execution. Interestingly, this gap allowed the distinct identity of the Welsh to coalesce. It ensured that when the Saxons finally did conquer the lowlands, they couldn't erase the Celtic soul of the island completely. For centuries in the foothills of the Pyrenees, in southern France and North Spain, an extraordinary secret lay hidden in plain sight. It revealed itself only when patterns in local family trees began to emerge. These families came from long lines of humble carpenters, basket makers, and rope makers, almost always relegated to the wrong parts of town. Beneath the surface was a 1,000-year-old story of a cursed and unique people. They were known as the Cagos, and their history is one of relentless stigma. Despite being genetically, linguistically, and religiously indistinguishable from their neighbors, they were cast out and treated as untouchables. For nearly a millennium, the only thing setting them apart was their descent from other Cagos. Their story raises haunting questions. Who were the Cagos, and why were they condemned so completely for reasons that not even their persecutors could clearly define? To be a Kago was to live a life governed by invisible boundaries and ritualized humiliation. From birth until death, every aspect of their existence was segregated, policed by a complex system of rules designed to enforce their status as quote-unquote unclean. The physical separation began with their homes. Kagos were confined to their own ghettos, which were invariably situated on the least desirable land. These were neighborhoods outside the main village walls, often on the far side of a river or in malarial marshlands. These areas were seen as being a safe distance from the markets, taverns, and shops of the rest of the population. This physical distance was reinforced by a litany of prohibitions built on a logic of contamination. It was believed that the Kagos were pestilential, their very touch capable of poisoning the world around them. They were forbidden from walking the common roads barefoot, lest they taint the earth. They couldn't touch the parapets of bridges, drink from public fountains, or enter taverns where other people drank. To handle food or wine in the market was a crime, and they were barred from owning livestock or farming the land. In one horrific instance in the early 18th century, a Kago who dared to try to farm was punished by having his feet impaled. There are many such instances of this disturbing cruelty perpetrated on these people by their neighbors. To ensure they could be identified at a glance, Kagos were forced to wear a badge. And I need to emphasize at this point that they looked identical to the people who surrounded them in every way, though some rumors would say this was only because of their dark magic. But back to the badge. This was a piece of red or yellow cloth, cut into the shape of a goose or duck's foot, sewn conspicuously onto their clothing. This mark, which earned them the derogatory nickname canards, or ducks en français, and served as a constant visible reminder of their status. Anyone found without their badge faced fines, or the confiscation of their clothes, or potentially even worse. In some regions, the parallels with another feared group were made explicit. Kagos were required to carry a wooden rattle, or claquette, to announce their approach, the same tool used by lepers to warn others to keep their distance. This practice cemented the association with disease in the public mind, even when there was no evidence to support it. Barred from nearly all professions, especially those involving food or agriculture, the Kagos were funneled into a narrow set of trades. They became the community's woodworkers, carpenters, barrel makers, rope makers, and tellingly, coffin makers. They were the hewers of wood for the towns they lived in. This restriction created a profound irony, and Kagos became highly skilled craftsmen, particularly as carpenters. Their labor was in high demand, and they were often the ones who built the magnificent wooden roofs and doors of the very churches that would become the sites of their greatest humiliation. They were simultaneously indispensable to the community for their skills and utterly rejected by it as people, a paradox that highlights the contradictory logic of their persecution. Nowhere was the Kagos' status as inclusive outcasts more apparent than in the house of God. Their treatment in church remains their most tangible legacy, etched into the very stone of dozens of chapels. They were forbidden from using the main entrance, instead being forced through small, low side doors. These doors required them to stoop over and virtually crawl into church, where their humiliation continued. They were confined to the coldest, darkest corners of the church, separated from the main congregation by a wooden railing. The ultimate degradation came during communion. They were often forbidden from partaking at all, especially by priests who had grown up in regions with these people. When priests would pass the Eucharist to them, it was a disturbing spectacle that caused disgust to outsiders who observed it. The Eucharist was passed to them on the end of a long wooden spoon or stick, as if feeding a dangerous animal. For centuries, historians have tried to pinpoint a reason for the relentless persecution of the Cagos. The sheer variety and outlandishness of the theories reveal more about the nature of prejudice than they do about the Cagos themselves. The search for a single origin is a hunt for a rational explanation for an irrational hatred. The most common and enduring explanation was that Cagos were the descendants of medieval lepers. This theory seemed logical, as it would explain the obsession with contamination and the similarities in treatment, such as the use of rattles. However, the historical record tells a different story, and hospital records of the time in southern France indicated that they forbid entry to Cagos, whether they were sick or not. The implication of these records is that it was accepted that there were Cagos who definitely weren't sick. Another set of theories cast the Cagos as the descendants of defeated enemies, their cursed status a kind of inherited treason. One theory suggests that they were the remnants of Muslim armies from the 8th century, though no evidence supports this. For instance, the names of Cagos are identical to those of their neighbors, and they adhered to all the same traditions, showing no signs of having originally been converts. Another theory suggests they are survivors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy. This explanation was strategically used by the Cagos themselves in a 1514 appeal to Pope Leo X, advising that they were very orthodox in their Catholic practice. However, like the other theories on their origin, this one crumbles under scrutiny. Historical records show Cago communities existed long before the Cathar heresy and in regions where it never took hold. Where history failed to provide a reason, myth and folklore rushed in to fill the void. Fantastical stories cast the Cagos as a people cursed by God himself. They were said to be descended from the carpenters who built the cross for Christ's crucifixion, which appeared to provide an explanation for why they were so good with wood. Notably, the description of what a Cago looked like is wildly inconsistent. Some said that they exclusively had blonde hair and blue eyes and were tall, while others said they were dark and swarthy and tended to be shorter. Others said that their true appearance was much more disturbing and that they had the ability to use powerful magic to alter their appearance and fit in with the regular population. In essence, though, the purpose of these stories wasn't to describe reality as it existed, but to dehumanize a class of people. After stripping away the layers of myth, failed historical theories, and rationalizations, we are left with a stark and unsettling conclusion. There was no original sin, and the only consistent, verifiable reason a person was a Cago was because their parents were Cagos. Their persecution was a tautology. They were hated because they were Cagos, and they were Cagos because they were hated. This system was maintained not by any visible difference, but by the meticulous record-keeping of local communities, particularly parish priests, who logged every birth and baptism. A Cago who moved to a new village could be easily identified by a letter from their former priest, and thus the persecution would continue. Despite centuries of oppression, the Cagos weren't merely passive victims. As mentioned briefly, in 1514 they banded together and appealed to the Pope, an Italian, who appears to have been confused as to why they were being persecuted. Cagos only existed as a class in southern France and in Basque country under the Spanish crown, and he was likely unfamiliar with them as a class. The Pope issued a decree that Cagos were good Christians and ought not to be treated any differently either in church or in society in general. It's unclear how much impact this had on the ground at the time, since local parish priests weren't writing up reports on this class of outcasts. Further, of course, parish priests weren't supposed to be discriminating against them to begin with, so the Pope's decree was really just a restatement of canon law as it stood anyway. In France, Cagos went before regional parliaments to challenge their segregation from the rest of the populace. One famous case in Toulouse dragged on for 40 years before the court finally decreed in 1600 that the Cagos were not lepers and shouldn't be treated as such. Interestingly, this also provides one data point to indicate that after it became clear that the Pope didn't want them to be discriminated against on religious grounds, the reasons changed. They were simply treated as lepers, and as such, by the logic of the time, they needed to be kept apart, despite what the Pope said about their practice of Catholicism. The true turning point came with the French Revolution in 1789. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality legally abolished all discriminatory laws against the Cagos, granting them, at least on paper, the full rights of citizenship. But the Cagos understood something profound about their condition. Their curse wasn't just a matter of law or social custom, it was written down in ink. Their oppression was bureaucratic, enshrined in the baptismal records and parish registers that had tracked their quote-unquote unclean lineage for centuries. During the chaos of the revolution, Cagos across the region took direct action. They stormed town halls and parish archives, seeking out the documents which proved their status and burned them. This was a targeted assault on the administrative machinery of their persecution. By destroying the official records, they were destroying the state's ability to see and enforce their hereditary status ever again. This act of liberation through erasure proved more effective than all the papal proclamations and royal decrees that had come before it. The destruction of the archives, combined with the new legal equality granted by the revolution, finally allowed the walls of the ghettos to crumble. Through the 19th and into the 20th century, the Cagos began to slowly assimilate. Intermarriage with non-Cagos became possible, and families moved away, changed their names, and shed the identity that had brought them nothing but suffering. The distinct Cago culture, forged in the crucible of persecution, simply vanished. In the end, the mystery of why these people were persecuted remains entirely unsolved. In the early 19th century, if you were standing on the northernmost shores of Siberia, you might have witnessed something baffling. Each spring, flocks of polar bears would rise into the air and fly north, directly over the frozen sea, disappearing beyond the horizon. Then, in the autumn, they would return, this time with their young. Birds can't nest on barren ice, and the evidence of life itself seemed to demand the existence of a hidden land somewhere to the north. This was a warm, fertile oasis, nestled in the heart of the polar wasteland. This natural mystery was the first clue, the first whisper of a place that would haunt the Russian imagination for over 2 centuries, a phantom island known as Sannikov Land. The story of Sannikov Land, or Zemlya Sannikova in Russian, begins with a credible witness. Yakov Sannikov was a seasoned frontiersman, ivory hunter, and explorer who knew the Arctic as well as anyone alive. He had already discovered and charted real islands, proving he could distinguish land from ice. During a cartographic expedition between 1809 and 1810, Sannikov stood on the northern coast of the new Siberian islands and saw something new. In 1811, he reported it officially: the clear silhouette of land with high mountains, far to the north of Kotelny Island. This was a distinct geographical feature, and when combined with the inexplicable flight of the geese, Sannikov's report created a powerful, scientifically plausible hypothesis. Also, as I'm editing this now, I just realized I said polar bears instead of polar geese earlier, and you know what? I'm keeping it in. For decades, the idea simmered in the minds of Russian explorers. Then, in 1886, it found its great champion. Baron Edward von Toll was a respected Baltic German geologist in Russian service, a man of science obsessed with the Arctic's secrets. Like Sannikov before him, Toll was on an expedition to the new Siberian islands when, on a day of perfect visibility, he saw it. From the shore of Kotelny Island, he described the sharp outline of four mountains. He was so convinced that he even estimated its distance and speculated as to the mineral composition of the mountains. He spent the next decade campaigning relentlessly, arguing before the Imperial Academy of Sciences that finding this land was a matter of Russian national prestige. Finally, in 1900, he got his wish, and Toll was appointed leader of the Russian polar expedition, setting sail on the schooner Zarya with a dual mission. He was to conduct broad scientific research and, for Toll, to finally set foot on Sannikov land itself. The expedition was grueling from the start, and the ship was plagued by leaks, and Toll clashed with his captain. They spent 2 punishing winters trapped in the pack ice, unable to break through to the island's supposed location. Interestingly, among the crew was a young, ambitious officer named Alexander Kolchak, who would be leading the white movement against the Reds just 2 decades later. After 2 years of frustration, Toll made a desperate gamble. In June 1902, he and 3 companions left the icebound Zarya. They would travel by kayak north to Bennett Island, a known outpost, and wait for the Zarya to pick them up when the ice finally cleared. The ship never made it as the ice was too severe, and the acting commander, following Toll's own contingency orders, was forced to sail south, leaving the 4 men stranded. The following spring, it was Kolchak, the future admiral, who led a daring rescue mission by whaleboat back to Bennett Island. He found Toll's camp, his scientific collections, and a final, heartbreaking note. Dated November 1902, it stated that the party was leaving the island and heading south by kayak, with provisions for only about 2 weeks. They were walking into the teeth of the polar night, a time of absolute darkness and treacherous, newly formed ice, and they were never seen again. The final chapter in the search came in the 1930s, when the Soviet Union, with its powerful new icebreakers and growing fleet of Arctic aircraft, decided to settle the question for good. In 1937, the icebreaker Sadko was dispatched with the explicit goal of finding Sannikov land. In a turn of profound maritime irony, the Sadko, an icebreaker, also became trapped in the ice and had to be rescued by an icebreaker. The final nail in the coffin came in 1938 when Soviet Arctic pilots flew extensive surveys over the entire region. From the air there was no hiding, and they confirmed, beyond the shadow of a cat's ass, that Sannikov land didn't exist. While this settled the historical tale of the Phantom Island, it did present a new scientific mystery in an attempt to explain what Sannikov and Toll saw. The first theory is that the island was real, but that by the 1930s, it was gone. Many islands in the New Siberian archipelago aren't solid rock, but are composed of a combination of permafrost and soil. These transient islands are incredibly vulnerable to coastal erosion, a process that is accelerating dramatically with rising Arctic temperatures. Notably, there's strong circumstantial evidence that this may be the case. The island of Mustak, in the same area, has seen extremely heavy coastline erosion at a rate of about 20 feet per year. It's entirely plausible that Sannikov land was one of these icy islands, and it simply melted and crumbled into the sea. The second theory is that they were tricked by the light. The Arctic is famous for powerful optical illusions called superior mirages. To an observer, this creates a shimmering, distorted image of a distant landmass appearing to float in the sky where there is only water. Many geographers today believe that what Sannikov and Toll saw was a mirage of Bennett Island, a real island located much farther north. Notably, The scientific understanding of these mirages was limited at the time. In a weird twist of fate, despite not actually existing, or perhaps because it doesn't actually exist, Sannikov land became a staple of Russian and Soviet culture in the 20th century. In 1926, the Soviet geologist Vladimir Obruchev wrote the science fiction novel aptly titled Sannikov Land. Obruchev, an expert on Siberia, gave the myth its enduring form, which continues on today, and has even morphed into a form of a conspiracy theory. Obruchev turned this non-existent island into an absolute paradise in Siberia in the Soviet popular imagination. He provided a clever scientific rationale for a warm Arctic utopia. The island was the caldera of a dormant volcano, its geothermal heat creating a lush, hidden world. He then populated it with mammoths and surviving Neanderthals. The book was wildly successful and was adapted into a movie in the 1970s. Notably, the author never claimed the work as anything but pure speculative fiction about a Siberian paradise. Despite this, some have argued that there is a real Arctic paradise in Sannikov land that the elites don't want anyone to know about for some reason. And trust me, there's totally nothing there, so don't go there looking for it under any circumstances whatsoever, because you definitely won't find a paradise full of mammoths.